The night Napoleon couldn't sleep. A history story, picture this. It's 2 a.m. June 17th, 1815. The most powerful man in Europe is lying awake in a cramped farmhouse, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he'll fight the most important battle of his life. But tonight, he can't sleep. And that sleepless night is about to change everything. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating what-if moments in history, all because one man couldn't get a good night's rest. So let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte in the Battle of Waterloo. But this isn't the story you learned in school. This is about how sleep, or the lack of it, became one of history's greatest games. First, you need to understand something about Napoleon. This guy was legendary for needing almost no sleep. Throughout his career, he famously claimed he only needed 4 hours a night, sometimes less. He'd work until 2 or 3 in the morning, sleep for a few hours, then wake up at dawn, ready to conquer another country before breakfast. His generals, exhausted, his staff, running on fumes. But Napoleon, the man was a machine. He believed sleep was for the weak, and frankly, for most of his career, it worked. He won battle after battle, conquered most of Europe, and built an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. His daily routine was absolutely insane. He'd spend 18 to 20 hours working, reviewing reports, planning campaigns, making decisions that affected millions of lives. His secretaries worked in shifts because they couldn't keep up with him. When they'd collapse from exhaustion, Napoleon would just call in the next one. There are stories of him dictating letters to 3 different secretaries, simultaneously one handling military correspondence, another dealing with domestic policy, a third managing diplomatic communications. His mind was like a supercomputer, processing multiple complex problems at once. But here's the thing about sleep. Debt it always comes to collect. And in June 1815, the bill came due at the worst possible moment. Let's set the scene. Napoleon had already lost everything once. After his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and his defeat by the Allied European powers, he'd been exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. But being Napoleon, he couldn't just retire and take up gardening. In March 1815, he escaped from Elba with just 1,000 men and returned to France in what we now call the 100 Days. It was one of the boldest moves in history. King Louis XVIII sent the French army to arrest him, but when Napoleon met them on the road, he opened his coat, exposed his chest, and said, "If any of you will shoot your emperor, here I am." Not a single soldier fired. Instead, they threw down their weapons and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" The French army, still loyal to their emperor, flocked back to his banner. King Louis XVIII literally fled the country. Napoleon was back, baby. But Europe wasn't having it. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately formed the 7th coalition against him. They assembled massive armies to crush Napoleon once and for all. The emperor knew he had to act fast. He had to defeat these armies before they could unite and overwhelm him with sheer numbers. His plan was brilliant, actually. He would march into Belgium, drive a wedge between the British army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blucher, and defeat them separately. Classic Napoleon strategy, divide and conquer. If he could destroy Wellington's army and scatter the Prussians, the other coalition members might lose their nerve and negotiate peace. It was risky, but it could work. Napoleon had pulled off similar miracles before. On June 15th, Napoleon's army crossed into Belgium and caught the Allied forces by surprise. Wellington and Blucher scrambled to concentrate their scattered forces. Napoleon had achieved his first objective he'd gotten between them. The next day, June 16th, Napoleon split his forces. He sent Marshal Ney to hold Wellington at a crossroads called Quatre-Bras, while Napoleon himself attacked the Prussians at Ligny with the bulk of his army. The Battle of Ligny was brutal. Thousands died in savage fighting. But by nightfall, Napoleon had won. The Prussians were retreating, and Napoleon was convinced he'd knocked them out of the war. He sent Marshal Grouchy with 30,000 men to pursue them and make sure they kept running. Meanwhile, Ney had fought Wellington to a draw at Quatre-Bras. Wellington, hearing about the Prussian defeat, decided to fall back to a defensive position. He'd scouted earlier a ridge near the village of Waterloo. Napoleon was confident. He'd beaten the Prussians. Now he just had to crush Wellington's outnumbered army, and the campaign would be won. Everything was falling into place. But he'd made a critical miscalculation. The Prussians weren't running away, they were regrouping. Blucher, that stubborn old warrior, had been injured in the battle when his horse fell on him, but he refused to give up. Instead of retreating east toward Prussia, he turned his army west toward what he was coming to help Wellington. Napoleon didn't know this, or maybe he knew but underestimated it. Either way, his intelligence was failing him, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. So we arrive at June 17th, 1815. Napoleon had just fought the Prussians at Ligny and technically won, pushing them back. The stage was set for a decisive battle the next day near Waterloo. Wellington had positioned his army on a ridge south of Waterloo, a strong defensive position. Napoleon's army was camped nearby at Planchenoit and La Belle Alliance, and everything was ready for a dawn attack that would crush the British before the Prussians could arrive to help them. But then the rain came, and I'm not talking about a light drizzle. This was a biblical downpour. The kind of rain that turns fields into swamps and roads into rivers of mud. Lightning flashed across the sky. Thunder boomed like artillery. Napoleon's soldiers spent the night soaked to the bone, trying to sleep in puddles, wrapped in wet blankets, shivering in the darkness. Many of them had no shelter at all. They huddled around campfires that kept getting extinguished by the rain, trying to keep their gunpowder dry. Some gave up and just lay in the mud, too exhausted to care anymore. And Napoleon. He was in a farmhouse called Le Caillou, which should have been comfortable enough, but he couldn't sleep. Now, why couldn't Napoleon sleep? Well, historians have debated this for 2 centuries, but we can piece together several factors. First, he was sick. Really sick. Napoleon had been suffering from painful hemorrhoids for days, not exactly the kind of thing that makes for restful sleep. Some historians also believe he might have had a urinary tract infection or bladder issues. Try commanding an army when you can't sit comfortably in a saddle and you have to pee every 20 minutes. Not fun. His physician, Dr. Larry, had noted that Napoleon's health had been declining for months. He'd gained weight, looked bloated, seemed constantly fatigued even before the campaign began. Some modern doctors who've studied the historical records think he might have had a hormonal disorder, possibly a pituitary adenoma or thyroid problems. Second, he was mentally exhausted. The past few months had been incredibly stressful. The weight of rebuilding his empire, the knowledge that this might be his last chance, the pressure of fighting against all of Europe, it was crushing. Every decision could mean the difference between triumph and oblivion. Third, there was the rain, the constant hammering of rain on the roof, the thunder, the lightning, the knowledge that his artillery, his biggest advantage, would be useless until the ground dried out. Every hour of delay meant the Prussians had more time to arrive. He knew this. Ite, ime. Napoleon's artillery was called his daughters because he loved them so much. He had the best artillery in Europe, and he knew how to use it. But artillery needs solid ground. On muddy fields, cannon wheels sink, guns can't be aimed properly, and even if you fire, the cannonballs just bury themselves in the soft earth instead of bouncing and cutting through enemy ranks. So he lay there, calculating, recalculating, knowing he had to wait, but hating every minute of it. And fourth, and this is crucial, years of sleep deprivation had finally caught up with him. Napoleon was 45 years old, and he'd spent 20 years running on minimal sleep. His body was breaking down. His famous mental sharpness was dulling. The superhuman endurance that had carried him through Russia, Egypt, Austria, Prussia was gone. So he lay there in pain, anxious, listening to the rain, unable to rest. His valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, later recalled that Napoleon paced the room, dictated letters, reviewed maps, went to the window repeatedly to check if the rain was stopping, and maybe slept for an hour or 2 at most. At one point during the night, Napoleon had his officers brought in for a conference. They discussed the battle plan. Some of them urged caution. General Rail warned that Wellington was a formidable defensive commander and that attacking him in a strong position was dangerous. But Napoleon dismissed the concerns. He was confident, maybe too confident. Wellington is a bad general, Napoleon said, and the English are bad troops. This will be easier than breakfast. It was the kind of arrogant statement Napoleon would never have made in his prime. He was underestimating his anemia, fatal mistake in warfare. Dawn came on June 18, 1815. Normally, Napoleon would have attacked at first light. That was his style. Hit hard, hit fast, overwhelmed the enemy before they knew what was happening. He'd won dozens of battles that way. But Napoleon was exhausted. His mind was foggy. His body ached. And the ground was a muddy disaster. His officers came to him with reports. The field was too soft. The artillery couldn't move properly should they wait. Against the advice of some of his officers, Napoleon decided to wait. He wanted the ground to dry out so his artillery could move and fire effectively. He convinced himself he had time. Wellington wasn't going anywhere, and surely the Prussians were too far away to matter. Grouchy was chasing them, keeping them busy. So the French army waited and waited. Soldiers cleaned their muskets, dried their powder, had breakfast. Officers reviewed the plan. Napoleon himself had a bath and breakfast, trying to wake up his sluggish mind. The attack that should have started at 6 a.m. didn't begin until 11:35 a.m. 5.5 hours. That's how long Napoleon delayed. In those 5.5 hours, the ground dried somewhat. But more importantly, the Prussian army marched closer and closer and closer. Blucher was driving his men hard, pushing them beyond normal endurance, because he'd promised Wellington he'd come. And unlike Napoleon, Blucher kept his promises. When the French finally attacked, they fought brilliantly. The opening move was a diversionary attack on the Château de Hagemont, a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. Napoleon wanted to draw Wellington's reserves to that sector before launching his main attack. But the attack on Hagemont became a meat grinder. What was supposed to be a quick diversion turned into an all-day battle as French infantry threw themselves at the chateau again and again. Wellington refused to weaken his main line, and the defenders held on with desperate courage. Around 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched his main attack, massive infantry assault on Wellington's left center. Wave after wave of French infantry charged up that ridge at Wellington's positions. The French soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, advanced in perfect formation despite horrific British artillery fire. They nearly broke through. Wellington's line bent dangerously. Men were dying by the hundreds, but the British and their allies held on. Just barely. Then came the cavalry. Marshal Ney, brave but impetuous, saw what he thought was a retreat and launched the French cavalry in a massive charge. Thousands of horsemen, the legendary cuirassiers in their gleaming breastplates, thundered across the muddy fields. It was one of the most spectacular sights in military history. But it was also a disaster. Wellington's infantry formed square-stipe formations that cavalry couldn't break. The French horsemen charged again and again, circling the squares, taking horrific casualties from musket fire, but unable to break through. And because Ney hadn't coordinated with the infantry, the cavalry attacked alone, unsupported. Napoleon watched this happen and did nothing to stop it. In his prime, he would have recognized the mistake immediately and called off the attack. But he was too tired, too slow, too far from his usual brilliance. Around 4:30 p.m., Napoleon's worst nightmare came true. Prussian troops appeared on his right flank. At first, it was just a few units. Napoleon detached part of his reserve to deal with them. But more Prussians kept coming. And more. And more. Wellington had been checking his watch all day, waiting for Blucher's forces. "Give me night or give me Blucher," he supposedly said. And Blucher came, hitting the French right flank like a hammer. Suddenly, Napoleon was fighting on two fronts. The battle he thought he could win in a few hours was turning into a nightmare. His troops were exhausted, running low on ammunition, and now they were being attacked from the side. Napoleon had to make a choice. Keep pressing Wellington, or turn to deal with the Prussians. He tried to do both, splitting his attention and his forces. It was the worst option. Where was Grouchy? Where were those 30,000 men who were supposed to be keeping the Prussians busy? They were miles away, chasing shadows, completely out of position. Napoleon had sent them orders to march toward the sound of the guns, but the orders came too late and Grouchy moved too slowly. By early evening, around 7 p.m., Napoleon was desperate. The battle was slipping away. The Prussians were pressing harder on his flank. Wellington's line, though battered, still held. Napoleon had one card left to play, the Imperial Guard, his elite veterans who had never been defeated in battle. These were the best soldiers in the world, men who had marched from Cairo to Moscow with Napoleon. They wore tall bearskin hats, carried the finest weapons, and had an aura of invincibility. Napoleon personally led them forward, partway riding among them, trying to inspire them with his presence. Then he positioned them for the attack and watched as they marched up that blood-soaked ridge in perfect formation, drums beating, flags flying. If they could break Wellington's line, the battle might still be won. Everything depended on them. The Imperial Guard advanced through smoke and carnage. They pushed past the wrecked remains of earlier attacks. They climbed that ridge, maintaining perfect order despite heavy fire, and then they hit Wellington's line. The fighting was savage. For a moment, it looked like the Guard might break through. But Wellington had positioned his best troops to meet them British Guards and Dutch troops who fought with desperate courage. The Imperial Guard, already tired from the uphill march through mud, couldn't sustain the attack. They wavered. Then, for the first time in their history, they broke. Someone in the French ranks shouted "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats, and panic spread through the French army like wildfire. If the Imperial Guard could be beaten, then all was lost. The unthinkable had happened. Wellington, seeing his moment, stood up in his stirrups and waved his hat forward. His entire line surged forward in a general advance. The French army, already exhausted and demoralized, collapsed. What had been an organized battle turned into a chaotic rout. Soldiers threw away their weapons and ran. Units dissolved into mobs. The legendary discipline of Napoleon's army evaporated in minutes. Napoleon himself tried to rally the old guard, the most senior and loyal troops. They formed squares around him, protecting their emperor even as the army disintegrated around him. But it was hopeless. The battle was over. Napoleon barely escaped. He rode away from the battlefield in the darkness, accompanied by a handful of loyal officers. Behind him, his army was being cut to pieces by pursuing Prussian cavalry. Blucher, despite being 72 years old and having been crushed under his horse 2 days earlier, personally led the pursuit, determined to destroy Napoleon's army completely. The casualties were horrific. Around 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured at Waterloo. The field was carpeted with bodies. Local villagers spent weeks burying the dead and caring for the wounded. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st. The government was already turning against him. His political support evaporated overnight. On June 22nd, just 4 days after Waterloo, he abdicated for the second and final time. By July, he was a prisoner of the British. They weren't taking any chances this time. No comfortable exile to a nearby island. They shipped him to St. Helena, a tiny speck of rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, about as far from Europe as you could get. Napoleon would spend the last 6 years of his life there, living in a damp house, slowly deteriorating in health, dictating his memoirs, and endlessly refighting his battles in his mind. He died on May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51. To the end, he talked about Waterloo. He blamed Grouchy for not arriving in time. He blamed Ney for wasting the cavalry. He blamed the rain, but did he ever blame his own exhaustion? We'll never know. But here's the thing that keeps historians up at night, and this is where our sleep angle comes full circle. What if Napoleon had slept well that night? What if he'd been sharp and clear-headed on June 18th? Think about it. If Napoleon had been well-rested, would he have waited those 5 crucial hours? Probably not. His entire military career was built on speed and decisiveness. A well-rested Napoleon attacks at dawn, hits Wellington before the British are fully prepared, and definitely before the Prussians can arrive. At 6 a.m., the Prussian army was still miles away. An early attack might have crushed Wellington before Blucher could save him. And if Wellington is defeated before the Prussians show up, Napoleon wins. He destroys the British army, turns to face the Prussians with his full force, and quite possibly defeats them too. Then what does Napoleon reconquer Europe? Probably not. The coalition was too strong, and France was exhausted. But he might have been able to negotiate a favorable peace. Maybe he keeps his throne. Maybe France remains the dominant European power. We're talking about a world that could look completely different. The 19th century without Britain's unchallenged dominance. The balance of power shifted, the Industrial Revolution taking a different path. And World War I, which grew out of the political situation created by Napoleon's defeat, might never happen or happens completely differently. All because one man couldn't sleep. Now, you might be thinking, come on, it can't all come down to one night of bad sleep, right? And you'd be partially correct. But modern sleep science actually backs this up in fascinating ways. Studies have shown that even one night of poor sleep significantly impairs cognitive function. Your decision-making gets worse, Your risk assessment becomes skewed, emotional regulation suffers, reaction time slows. And Napoleon wasn't dealing with just one bad night. He was dealing with decades of insufficient sleep catching up with him at the worst possible moment. Research from military studies shows that sleep-deprived commanders make more errors, take longer to make decisions, and are more likely to stick with failing strategies instead of adapting. Sound familiar? Military historians have noted that Napoleon's decision-making at Waterloo was uncharacteristically poor. He was slower to react, less flexible in his tactics, and made strategic errors he'd never made before. His famous coup d'etat, his ability to instantly assess a battlefield and see the winning move, was gone. There's even evidence that his chronic sleep deprivation might have been affecting his physical health in ways that contributed to his defeat. Some medical historians believe he might have had a pituitary tumor or thyroid issues, conditions that can be exacerbated by stress and lack of sleep. These conditions cause weight gain, fatigue, and cognitive impairment, all things Napoleon was experiencing in 1815. And Waterloo isn't even the only time sleep changed military history. The list is actually pretty long. During World War II, Hitler famously refused to be woken up on D-Day morning. June 6, 1944, his staff knew the Allies were landing in Normandy, but nobody dared wake the Führer from his sleep. He'd been up late the night before and had given strict orders not to be disturbed. By the time he woke up, naturally, hours had passed hours that the Allies used to establish their beats. German panzer divisions that might have counterattacked sat idle, waiting for orders that couldn't come because Hitler was asleep. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, JFK and his advisors were operating on minimal sleep for 13 days straight. They were making decisions that could literally end human civilization while running on caffeine and adrenaline. Some historians credit their fatigue with several near-catastrophic mistakes, but others credit Kennedy's decision to sleep on his final decision before acting as possibly saving the world. He went to bed on the night of October 27th, the worst day of the crisis, and woke up with a clearer head and chose negotiation over confrontation. George Washington's troops were exhausted when they crossed the Delaware on Christmas night 1776, but Washington himself had slept well and was sharp enough to pull off one of the greatest surprise attacks in military history, turning the tide of the American Revolution. During the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur made the catastrophic decision to advance toward the Chinese border despite warnings, partly because he was exhausted from constant stress and irregular sleep. The Chinese intervention that followed nearly destroyed the United Nations forces. Sleep or the lack of it has toppled empires and saved nations. It's one of the most underrated factors in history. So what's the lesson here? Well, if you're planning to conquer Europe, maybe get 8 hours of sleep first. But seriously, Napoleon's story is a powerful reminder that we're not machines. We can't run on fumes forever. Eventually, biology wins. Napoleon built his reputation on being superhuman, on needing less sleep than everyone else, on outworking and outthinking his enemies through sheer willpower. And it worked until it didn't. The irony is that if Napoleon had prioritized sleep, if he'd taken care of his health, if he'd listened to his body instead of pushing through exhaustion, he might have remained Emperor of France. His greatest strength, his relentless drive, became his greatest weakness. Modern neuroscience tells us that sleep isn't a luxury or a sign of weakness. It's when your brain consolidates memories, processes information, and repairs itself. Skipping sleep is like trying to run a computer without ever defragmenting the hard drive or clearing the cache. Eventually, it just stops working efficiently. And the effects are cumulative. You can't catch up on sleep. Sleep debt accumulates over time, degrading your performance gradually until one day, at the worst possible moment, your brain just can't perform anymore. So, there you have it, the story of how one sleepless night changed European history. The next time you're lying awake at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, stressing about tomorrow, remember, you're in good company. Even emperors have those nights. But also remember that lack of sleep matters more than you think. Napoleon learned that lesson the hard way, on a muddy field in Belgium, watching his empire die because he was too tired to save it. Hopefully, we can learn from his mistake without having to lose an empire in the process. The Battle of Waterloo ended Napoleon's career, but it began with a single sleepless night. History turned on something as simple as one man's inability to rest. Makes you think, doesn't it? How many of our own decisions, our own lives, might be shaped by something as basic as whether we got enough sleep? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more history content where we explore the strange, overlooked details that changed the world. Drop a comment, Beludu. You think Napoleon could have won Waterloo if he'd slept better? What other historical events do you think were influenced by sleep or lack of it? I'd love to hear your theories. And most importantly, tonight, when you go to bed, sleep well. You never know when you might need to be at your best to change the world, or at least not lose it. Take care of yourself. Your body and mind need rest, even if you think you're superhuman. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Now, if you'll excuse me, all this talk about sleep has made me tired. Good night.